Hello, everybody. Hello again. Thank you for joining the three of us on this next installment with myself, Rick Chrisman, Interim Senior Minister at Newton, Elliott Church of Newton, and my two new friends, Pharaoh Saunders. Sorry for the hesitation there. I always want to call you Saunders, and I don't know why, but it's Pharaoh Saunders, a biblical name. Yeah, that should be easy for me. And with Diane Wong. The three of us were brought together by the Newton Cultural Council, who is a partial sponsor of these series and has gotten us acquainted, and we're roaring along from topic to topic. We hardly can bring ourselves to stop at the end of the 20 or 25 minutes that we've budgeted for each session. And many of the topics blend into each other. We find that we can't just draw a box around one of them. Like today, I think we had shot for, Diane, did you say we were going to talk about emancipation and equaling abandonment? And another topic we want to touch on is one that Pharaoh did such a great job of on a video called Caricature of Black People in the 19th Century, pre-Civil War and post-Civil War. So we're going to try and touch on these things, the goal being to activate, well, my goal is to activate white people, get them out of the condition of guilt and embarrassment and embrace this subject as one that is important to their souls as well as to this nation, and to catch this wave. Now, of course, the news cycle has turned in another direction because of the Afghanistan crisis and because of Haiti's crisis and the COVID crisis, but this is still with us. And that's our goal, is to raise people's consciousness and spur white people to action. So let me lead off with you, Diane, if I may. We want to talk about the abandonment of Black people by this society, by government and by churches, for that matter, or individuals. Where do we go with this theme that you've identified? Abandonment, remember the 40...
I remember. Are we being invaded by children?
Yes, there's a playground outside my window.
Oh, okay. I just like to know where these sounds come from. Okay, well, that's great. Okay, let's look at that as a sign, and let's talk from there. So that what I heard just now was just full on excitement and just happiness. And that's what happens when you are living from your inside and you're not living from whatever's going on outside. And kids are able to do that. So I'm going to take that as a sign for what we should do. Let's start to live from inside of ourselves. Let's try to be who we are. Let's try to even find out who that is. Let's do that. So yeah, abandonment. So all kinds of things go through my head. The reason, yes, abandonment by a country and a government, but that had captured and enslaved them, brought them from another country and another whole environment, whatever that was, to this country, to do the work, the hard work of building this country. And so slavery in the United States, it wasn't a blip on the screen. It was hundreds of years. We had slavery longer than we've had no slavery. And we've had freedom for Black people. As we like to say, we are free-ish. We've never attained the freedom that is ascribed to in the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Never had that. So that, yes, abandoned, but that was kind of a good thing because the 20 ministers, Black ministers, that met with General Sherman to talk about what was going to happen to Black people after the war. And he asked them, he said, okay, do you want to be incorporated into the society, live with white people, or would you rather be by yourselves? And they said to a person, by ourselves. That I don't think that was because of introvert kind of nature. I think that was the result of nearly 300 years of brutal treatment by white people. So they just wanted to be left alone, but they knew that they needed the wherewithal to live. They were free, sort of. They were allowed to leave their plantations or wherever they were, but with nothing. So that they didn't have food, they didn't have shelter. They had what raggedy clothes they had on their back. And so they kind of meandered off, and that was it. And so during that time in the South is ravaged. There's sickness and disease everywhere. So they started to be sick and dying. And one of the things, I love these ministers. One minister, forget his name, but he said, we expected the Black man to be like his brother, the native of the forest, and disappear. They just expected they were just going to just die off. And I've done a fair amount of research reading about, all you have to do is go back and you can read what people were actually saying at the time. And Black people were considered poorly, not healthy. So they always held that and said, look at here, they're not only ignorant, but they're unhealthy and they bring disease. So that gets into the caricature that Pharaoh is our resident expert on that. But I have some comments on that too. But absolutely abandoned. But had they been really abandoned and left alone, they could have survived. But they were never left alone. They were always followed and beaten and burned and slashed and run out of town. So we'll talk more about that.
Right. Well, before there was discrimination and rejection, there was just what you're calling the simple fact of abandonment, and on top of which was the hope that they would just disappear, like the Native Americans, which of course they didn't disappear automatically. They had to be driven and beaten and murdered as they backed away from their homelands in the Southeast, particularly at first through the Trail of Tears. Abandonment was the very first reaction. And there was the offer of 40 acres and a mule. Did that ever bear fruit? Pharaoh, was that a program that worked for the recently unenslaved?
No, it did not go through. That was something that was issued as a field order by General Sherman, who we were just talking about actually during the Civil War. But it wasn't anything passed by Congress. It wasn't anything that had any judicial or executive authority. It was a field order by a general in the military as a different thing. And it was an important thing in terms of history, in terms of how we perceive that time frame during the war. And so it's something that is in the forefront of a lot of people's minds, but it has a lot less teeth than people seem to think that it does, because it was what it was. It was just an order given by an army general.
Well, that would be me. I was under the impression that it was legislated and obligated, but you're saying that it could be carried out randomly, I guess, by who? People who were what? Generous enough to give this pittance to the former slaves?
No, that's the interesting thing about all history. You see that certain things happen and everything changes. It was moving along into Congress. It never made it to be, and it was never enacted in Congress. The Republicans at that time who switched with the Democrats. So nobody thinks we're really talking about today's Republicans.
No.
But the Republicans of those days were, they took it up, and those
Federalists, we can say.
they took it up and they were moving it along. But unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln, this general was a general for Abraham Lincoln. He was, as we all know, he was assassinated, and the next president vetoed all of that. So it had some. It could have gone.
It could have gone farther,
but
for
it
sure,
didn't.
but it didn't end up going. It never actually got congressional approval or anything.
No, but but certain Black people did get the land on the I think it was South Carolina, the rice land on the South Carolina coast, and held that land for, well, it wasn't that long. Before, it was right after the war ended, that the new president said and told General Sherman and the people who had participated in giving out the land, that they had to go and take the land back and return it to its former owners. So that's what there were Black people living on the land. They were there only months, I think, and they had planted a crop and all that kind of thing. And then they were told that they had to leave. So it was hard times. It was hard times.
It's hard to imagine that anybody could think that you could turn the formerly enslaved people out upon the bosom of nature just to scratch out a living from the hard earth. The abandonment was almost like abandoning the way they like infanticide was in the Greek Empire, where they left children out to die on the mountainside that you didn't want. So it was a combination of extraordinary hostility to leave them to their own devices following the period of slavery, which left them with nothing, of course, to start with.
But see, there was a plan, and that's what we talked about last time. The plan was the Black Codes. So the southern states, the plan was, you've got all these Black people, we've got all these crops, the crops need to be harvested. Black people are standing around, so they enacted Black Codes. If you're standing around, you don't have employment, if you don't have whatever it is that they didn't have, then you could be arrested and then rented out. And so that's how sharecropping got started. So we moved away from having your own land to being sharecroppers and take whatever your former enslavers would give you. And they weren't welcomed. They were never welcomed in the South by anybody. None of the white people. They weren't even considered humans. That was we're going to get into that. The caricature was very easy to get into because right from the beginning they said, Black people have no rights, that a white man needs respect. And that carries over from the beginnings, before the beginnings of this country, and carries over still today.
Well, Pharaoh, share what you know about the early depiction of African Americans, both in the slavery period and then after they were freed.
Well, the thing that, so to those who may not be clear, we often have little pre-discussions about certain topics, but this is one we were holding off on until now. But what I was going to say on that subject is something that's important to really take account of is it's not so much just a modern trend, this aspect of cultural appropriation. It's something that you can even trace to those early contextual and historical examples. It's just in situations that may not be perceived as directly or may not be as directly thought of because of how integrated they can be in the modern day to all sorts of things that we just take for granted in American society. I think the biggest examples of that, even from like early slavery periods, comes from things like food. That's a huge thing. The amount of influence from African cooking and African American cooking innovations that were just adopted into American society from a very early point that just became standard. And so it wasn't necessarily thought of, and I imagine a lot of people don't necessarily think of it as cultural appropriation in the way people often do in the modern sense. But it's a very similar concept, and I would argue that it is fundamentally the same thing. I would say that you have a little more contemporary examples, but still a little more early than some people might think of, like adoption of music from anything, rock and roll, jazz, all of that.
Well, my growing up period coincided with the popularity of a radio show. I guess another caricature was Amos and Andy. I hardly remember.
Amos and Andy. I knew you were gonna say that.
I hardly remember a thing about it. But looking back today, I can retrospectively see that this was clearly caricature. But I had no basis for understanding that as I grew up in the Midwest, in the white rural Illinois Midwest, and didn't have any basis for understanding what I was hearing.
What's interesting about that is that you can have those things be simultaneous, because all of those things were happening at the same time. You still had the caricature and the denigration, sort of viewing this group as, at best, something to mock or to make light of, or, belittle. At worst, view as subhuman and unworthy of anything from rights to life.
Well, especially, I mean, these are, I presume, produced by white people. So who gave white people leave to make this kind of portrayal? But then you can fast forward, and the same question could be asked of Norman Lear. I don't know how many people are, well, I expect a lot of people are aware that Norman Lear had invented the show All in the Family and the Jeffersons, and there were another couple, Good Times, which involved attitudes about Blacks in America. And here was a white man creating these shows that were terrifically popular, but they were also the targets of tremendous criticism from both sides. The whites were saying Archie Bunker is a caricature, that's nobody we know. And Blacks were saying, well, Sanford and Son, that was another one. This is another white man's portrayal of Black people. But the fact is that I guess you could say he got the subject in front of the television audience in a way that it wasn't before.
And that's not a small thing. Maybe even Amos and Andy, because if you look back at Gone with the Wind, and you have the one Hattie McDaniels, I think, or Donald, she won an Academy Award for her role as the man. Well, that there was no other place to go if you were Black, and in these white films. If you're interested, I mean, people can look back. There were Black films being produced at the same time, still kind of caricaturish, but but from a Black perspective. But the caricature went right along with the scientific racism, because at the same time that these were Jim Crow caricatures. So when you look back and I tell you what, look at this. This is what I think about all the time. Look at those cartoons. Look at that crow. Look at that. Look at those cartoons. And I talk to my children about this. Now they're adults. And I remember I used to plant them right in front of those cartoons, watching those. They are just totally racist. And you could tell it by listening. You look at the behavior of the animals, and you can see that these are portraying Black people. And so when you've got these gross caricature, scientific racism, and Plessy versus Ferguson separate segregation, then, I mean, it's a perfect storm. So that, I mean, right now we're totally 100%, almost, we're pretty much a segregated society. I mean, even here in the Northeast, out in Newton, I mean, you're almost all white. I mean, there are a couple of people out there, but and that came to be during the whole redlining. So the Black people until recently couldn't move and didn't find a welcome mat out anywhere. So all of those things, if you see that, you know, you hear it, you see it in your cartoons, you see, and it's really funny, ha, 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 ha. You watch it, and you look at sharecropping as a kind of a work that Black people do. If you're white, you get it in your mind, and it seeps into your DNA. This is who Black people are.
Well, no, and when what you're talking about was occurring in a vacuum, there was no platform for Black culture to present its own presentation, its own perception of itself. I'm supposing that you know, there was no counterpart to Amos and Andy that reflected Black life correctly. And as you were saying, there was no work in Hollywood for Blacks except for what the white scripts permitted. But today now, if you, for instance, I don't know if you watched the other night when New York City had its, you know, welcome back to the city on the eve of the hurricane. You know, there was a full representation of rap on the stage, and they had the platform that was never, you know, the prime platform that was never extended to Blacks until very recently.
See, that, I think that's to me, that's one of the significant things. Black people, so we're talking, you know, almost 300 years of slavery, and then a free sort of free to starve or wherever, or, you know, just die. And then, but there was no grounding because all of that was lost. So you don't just, what do? You can't, how do you get back into whatever culture you might have had? So Black people grew out of, Black people are American. They're more American than anybody, because what the culture now that we see, that you talk about on the stage, that grows out of this milieu of whiteness, living in white supremacy, being Black, learning to express yourself, finding a way out of no way. So that is what, and so they are good. Look at the Olympics, look at the Black stars, look at your sports, look at anything that Black people have a real opportunity to participate in. Black people are stars because they've had to struggle. I mean, there's something to be said about, you know, you have to really make a way out of no way.
Well,
you have to draw something from deep inside of you.
Well, let me ask Pharaoh about the cultural side of that. You mentioned athletes and so on. Of course, they do become stars, but it's also true in the art world, in the cultural world, in films. In the last 10 years, there has been an avalanche of great films by Black directors and producers, Ava DuVernay, Steve McQueen in England. Well, of course, and it was all started by Spike Lee back in, you know, right around the 1990 with Do the Right Thing and She's Gotta Have It and a half a dozen other brilliant movies. So that platform is now being used much more effectively. But I wanted to ask Pharaoh from a historical perspective, you know, the first surfacing of Black culture to the white world seemed to me to be the Harlem Renaissance, which cut in two directions. One, yes, it featured great musicians, singers, and poets and writers, but it also became a place that white culture in New York particularly flocked to as a kind of exotic, out of the mainstream adventure. Right, it had not attained the level that it has today. Would I be right about that?
I think that there's a lot of truth to that, but even still, I would say that there is much more exposure to that between white people, sort of being, around and through osmosis, obtaining sort of aspects of Black culture into themselves. That's something that goes back centuries. It's just, I think that it has definitely ramped up, and I think what you're describing with the Harlem Renaissance would probably be, if you were to use such a term, an example of white exposure. And even if it was like you said, it was bohemian, it wasn't like, mainstream at the time just yet, but still larger scale exposure to African American high culture, like that sort of thing. I think that you could say that's accurate.
Yeah. Well, that you're right in calling it high culture, because these artists in Harlem were aspiring to be mainstream, to speak to the nation and to the world. In fact, actually beyond the nation, to the world. Some of them even had to leave the United States to sing their song and write their poems, like James Baldwin left too, and many others did. But finally, what happened, it seems to me, is that African Americans claimed the stage. I guess that's this part of the story I want to highlight and to thank thank people for the money and the courage, Black people for the money and the courage to put that story, their story, forward.
But Rick, and it still has not been without pushback. So I often think in the United States, as we're moving forward, that the time has come for us to start to support one another, to just, instead of, and this goes to one of the things that we had said we were going to talk about, which is the way the schools are paid for, the tax base that we use. So that's not really conducive to finding people who want to bring new things, who want to get inside of themselves and bring out. That's what we need to do. We need to look inside all these kids, and we need to draw out of them everything that they came here to do. So that, and then look at what we could have. Black people are doing all this and still being pushed back, still being mass incarcerated, still being killed by the police. What if we were really supporting that? Maybe everybody in society could be better off, but it goes to what you're pointing at, which is the continuation of the stereotypes, this continuation of seeing Black people in this negative light, so that if I'm white, I'm going to be white now. Here I am. And I'm white. I'm walking down the street, and I'm saying I'm in Newton, and I'm in a neighborhood that's white. Not hard. That's not a big stretch. I'm in a white neighborhood, and I see a Black person. Just like that, in my mind, hundreds of years of stereotypes flood in, and I see this person, and something says to me, what is he doing here? He's probably up to no good. I need to watch him, and mainly I'm afraid for my life, and I need to call the police. So that is today 100%. And in spite of that, Black people are thriving. What can we have as a society? I mean, what is the whole point of the United States anyway, except to be a multiracial, multicultural society, different from everybody else in the world, to show the way? And so we still have to do that. That's still our charge.
Well, it is. And we'll wrap up this section by my reminding people that one of your programs is called Racial Resilience, Beyond White Defensiveness to Racial Resilience. I love the phrase racial resilience. And what you're talking about is for white people to get on board with a completely new, with an affirmation of our multiracial society. But it's a hard fight, as you say.
We're talking about that, Rick, but we're going back to what you originally said about finding or saving souls. We're talking about the soul of white people. White people, somebody told me that I respect, told me that white people had lost their way, totally lost their soul. And Martin Luther King came along and made it possible, again, opened up the door. And so that, to me, I don't think there's anything more important to everybody than white people retrieving their humanity, especially Christians.
Well, we're going to take that up seriously. Now, Pharaoh has a dissenting opinion on this, so we're just going to adjourn this session and invite everybody to come back next week when the three of us are going to resume this conversation. So thank you, Diane. Thank you, Pharaoh. And I'll be seeing all of you soon, actually. Back to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.